Hello, so this is our lecture, the video lecture for the day that I'm going to be gone. So today we're talking about parental care. With this lecture, I've also posted a link to the YouTube video that we would normally watch in class. Please watch that and think about the behavior that we'd be doing there. Obviously, we can't have that little bit of discussion, but I still want to make sure you get a chance to see it. So when we talk about parental care, we're talking about provisioning your offspring at a cost to yourself. If there is no cost, then it's not, really care. It's just, sort of a behavior. There isn't a cost there. So, but almost all behaviors have some cost, at least a time cost and an energy cost. At least you're investing your time in something that prevents you from investing in something else, right? Prevents you from going and gathering more resources for yourself, prevents you from going and finding another mate. So there's some sort of cost there. And we can also, because of course, the key thing about everything we look at in terms of cost and benefit is how much you can get of your genes into the next generation. So to some degree, we can think about this cost as a benefit to the current offspring versus a cost to potential future offspring. Now, there are extreme cases of this where animals will only have one brood in their entire lifetime, and so they can invest everything in that brood. So for example, here we have a Sicilian amphibian, this worm-like thing that's actually an amphibian. And the mother Sicilians only produce one brood. They live with their offspring, and their offspring actually feed on their skin as a form of provisioning. So instead of producing milk or going out and gathering food for them, they actually have a very lipid-rich, fat-rich skin, and the offspring eat that skin off with these special scraping teeth that are specifically for that purpose. This is a fairly extreme case of provisioning and parental care, but it makes perfect sense if you realize that this animal is not going to have another brood. Now, in the case of animals that do have the potential of a future brood, they're making trade-offs between how much do I invest in this brood versus how much do I save for potential future broods. And this can lead to conflicts about who's going to provide that care. Now, in most species, there's no parental care. The eggs are abandoned, and then they either survive or they don't. In most species that do have parental care, it's the mother that cares. However, there are plenty of species where the father cares or both parents care. And this is an interesting example, the penduline tits. So in penduline tits, we sort of have the evolutionary conflict over care, who cares, the mother, the father, both, neither. That's usually a conflict that sort of happens on evolutionary time scale. Here, this is a conflict that actually happens in a decision-making time scale. So these birds build a nest together. The female lays eggs, and sometimes both parents stay in care, but usually one of the parents deserts, abandons the nest, and leaves the other parent to care. Now, one parent is perfectly capable of taking care of the offspring, but it's costly. It decreases their likelihood of having more offspring in the future. So, ideally, you would like to be the one that deserts. And sometimes it's the mother, sometimes it's the father. But if both of them desert, then all the offspring die. So sometimes that does happen. And that can happen either when basically they both make the decision to desert around the same time, or when one deserts and the other one is not in good condition and the other one says, well, better to try and save up for next year. And that can absolutely happen as well. So there's this sort of active conflict between the mother and the father about who's going to stay and take care of these offspring. And how it's determined who cares one thing that's really important here is paternity and maternity certainty. Now, as mammals, maternity certainty is really obvious, right? With the exception of very rare cases of genetic chimera, you know who the mother is. The baby emerges from the mother's body, so that's very clear. But that's not always true in the case of eggs. So if once eggs have been laid, in order to know that they're the mothers, they have to be identifiable. And if there's any sort of communal egg laying, you may not know who's, which eggs are whose. Now, so what we can have is there maternity certainty and is there paternity certainty? In fish, the eggs are actually fertilized in most fish. There are fish with internal fertilization, but most fish are fertilized after they leave the mother's body. Which means that the father actually has very high paternity certainty. He's the male that fertilizes those eggs. And so when he has high paternity certainty, then he's more likely to provide this care. Now, in this example with the bluegill here, they took males and had them have their set of eggs that they would provide care for. And then if they either left them alone or showed them another male who was blocked off by glass, but who looked to them like he could potentially be a threat, potentially fertilize some of these eggs. And so when he's exposed to another male with these eggs, so normally over 80% of them provide care. They provide good care here. But when he's exposed to seeing another male, that drops significantly to below 60%. When it was fry, so these have already hatched, so fertilization has clearly already taken place, he actually provides more care after being exposed, probably not significantly, but slightly more care after being exposed to another male, potentially seeing that male as a threat to his offspring, because he knows, there's no paternity uncertainty when the fry, when he's exposed to another male with just fry around. So we can see that this paternity certainty has a really big impact on his willingness to provide care. And we do see that in general, that in species where paternity certainty is high, we're much more likely to see either biparental care or male-only care. And so we often see the combination where you see biparental care. You often also see monogamy and mate guarding, where that male is working really hard to ensure that those eggs are only fertilized by him, that his partner is not actually mating with anyone else, potentially jeopardizing his paternity. Now, one reason that we can have this conflict here is this cost of parental care, right? Now, in St. Peter's fish, we find that sometimes the males care, sometimes the females care. But the females caring has a much higher cost to the females because, as we've discussed before, the female investment is higher. Eggs are more costly than sperm. So females using energy to care for a clutch, first of all, they've just spent all that energy creating the clutch, and then they're spending the energy caring for the clutch. It takes them a lot longer to reproduce again to be able to have the energy to build up another clutch of eggs. So we can see that parental females, if they're, these are females that have had a new clutch, and the question is, are they caring for the eggs, or did they leave the male to care for the eggs? And females that are caring for the eggs takes about 25 days between clutches, whereas if they're not caring for the eggs, it's less than 15. For males, there's a slight increase in the time to spawn, but you'll see that even for the parental males, it's actually a shorter increase than it is for the non-parental females. So it's not nearly, there's still a few days of difference, but it's not nearly as big a difference between these two. All right, so now we've talked about who cares, the males, the females, both, neither. But we also need to care about talk about providing care. So this is a situation where here we have a cuckoo. So a cuckoo is a nest parasite, where the cuckoos lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and then the baby cuckoos, are raised by the parents of that nest. Now you'll notice there is one baby in this nest, and it is a cuckoo baby that is bigger than the actual parent bird that's caring for it. You might think, how does this happen? Why isn't this really obvious to the parent that something has happened? Now, what's really interesting here is some of this seems to be a failure of discrimination, a failure to notice that something is wrong. But there's also the cuckoo mafia. So the cuckoo mafia, the mother cuckoo will check around the nests that she's laid her eggs in. And if her eggs are destroyed, she'll go in and destroy the nest, and any eggs that are in it. So this means that for one of these birds, if they're going to have a second brood in that year, they might weirdly be better off raising the cuckoo and then trying again than kicking the cuckoo egg out and then having the mother cuckoo destroy their nest afterwards. So there's a real question about whether this is a failure to distinguish that this isn't a cuckoo egg, or effectively accepting this, maybe an evolved failure where there's no benefit to learning this discrimination. Now, even when there are the correct offspring in the nest, you still might want to discriminate. So if there are a bunch of offspring and food is limited, it makes sense to allocate to the offspring that need the food the most, but are going to survive. So you don't want to allocate it all to the couple of best ones if you've got enough food to feed all of them. You want to distribute it among them, but you also don't want to allocate a bunch of food to a weak offspring that's going to die anyway, especially if you're having trouble provisioning all of them effectively. So here we have some barn swallows, and we generally have begging calls, and these begging calls are, they're loud. So they're a risk of attracting predator attention. They're energy expensive. They're they're straining. They're calling. There's a cost here. So this makes this an honest signal of how hungry am I? How much do I need food? Because there's less benefit in doing this begging call if you don't really need the food that much. But in addition, they're often showing something of quality. How loud can the animal call? And in addition, so here we see these gapes, this mouth opening here. And the redness of that is showing how red their blood is, how thin, how visible it is through their skin, how high quality, how good condition they are. In individuals that have a high parasite load or otherwise not doing as well, this gape will often be less red. And so investigators did a experiment where they added a little bit of food coloring to the gapes to either exaggerate that redness or just have a neutral effect. So they gave them a drop of red food coloring, a drop of yellow food coloring to control for that food coloring, or just a plain drop of water to see what happened. So before, you can see they're all getting about the same amount of food. And then after, these ones with the red gapes, with that red drop of red food coloring, suddenly are getting, twice as much food as they were before, and twice as much food as their siblings with yellow or water droplets, indicating that the parents are responding to this very red color as a signal of quality, and giving those individuals more food because they're signaling a higher quality. Now, there's another way that we can see bias, and this is based on sex ratio. Now, this can be different in different species. So here we have our mason bees. So mason bees are solitary bees. They provision a cell, they lay an egg, they put food in it, and they close it up. Now, as a mason bee gets older, a female mason bee, she declines in her ability to effectively provision. There's wing damage, there's age damage. Just as she gets older, she can't provision these cells as effectively. And so we get less provisioning per cell. And what we see is that, so this is the proportion of females, proportion of the eggs that she lays that are female. And when provisioning efficiency is low, she lays a lot more male eggs. When provisioning efficiency is high, she lays more female eggs. And she can choose this because in Hymenoptera, bees, ants, and wasps, male eggs are unfertilized eggs. They're haploid eggs. So these are as a haplodiploid species. Females are diploid, males are haploid. So males are laid from unfertilized eggs. So she can lay more male eggs or more female eggs just based on deciding whether or not to fertilize them. So when she can't provision as well, she's laying more male eggs. This is because in this species in particular, the females really require that high level of provisioning, high body condition to be able to do this all on their own the next next summer. Whereas the males only need to mate and die. So it doesn't really matter their body condition as much. Now we can see the exact opposite in a lot of species where there's male-male competition and males need to grow larger, where we'll actually see males being provisioned more. So this can go either way depending on the species itself. All right, now, besides this, there can be very intense competition between the offspring to the point where there can actually be siblicide, where one sibling will kill another sibling. And here we've got to think about, why would the parents allow siblicide? So we're looking at what's the advantage to allowing siblicide rather than having fewer offspring. This siblicide allows the parents to let the offspring compete, and so the fittest offspring are going to survive. If the investment of producing an offspring in the first place is small relative to the investment in parental care, then it can make sense to produce extra offspring and let them have this conflict and then only rear the ones that are successful. It also can potentially allow for backup offspring. So let's say you can only actually care for one offspring per season. Well, what happens if that offspring dies early? If you've got a mating season, you may not be able to just produce another offspring. So there are some where they produce an extra offspring, a backup offspring, that they know is going to die. Maybe sometimes the egg is laid a few days later, sometimes it's smaller, whatever. But that allows for a backup offspring. And then as long as the first offspring is healthy and successful, it's going to kill off the other offspring. They'll have one. On the other hand, if something goes wrong with that first offspring, they have a backup. Now, on the other hand, if you have enough resources, obviously you want to prevent siblicide. You don't want the destruction of these. Now, here's where we get an interesting conflict, because parents are 50% related to their offspring. Siblings are generally also 50% related to their offspring. So they're equally related. Siblings want their siblings to survive from a fitness genetic perspective. However, an individual offspring is 100% related to itself and only 50% related to its sibling. So if there's going to be a trade-off, they're going to prefer themselves over the sibling. Whereas parents don't have a conflict. They would prefer all of the siblings equally in terms of the genetic fitness. And so that allows this, sort of causes this conflict where in some cases, say, if you've got, 4 offspring, there's a 75% chance that all of them will survive. But if you've got 3 offspring, it goes up to 90%. Now, if you're one of the individuals in the nest, killing off one of them and having a better chance of surviving could be a major advantage. On the other hand, if you're a parent, they've all got a pretty good chance of surviving, and you'd rather they all did. So we can have that trade-off depending on what we're looking at. On the other side of this, we can have cooperative brood care. So in the Seychelles warbler, for example, the offspring often stick around and help care for the next generation of offspring, help care for siblings. Once again, raising a sibling is actually the same amount of a full sibling, where it's 50% related to, shares the same mother and the same father. Raising that sibling is the same advantage to you as raising an offspring. So if by sticking around, you can help your parents have more offspring and produce full siblings, that can be just as big an advantage as producing your own offspring. And in particular, this is something we often see in young birds who would have low breeding success in their first year. It often makes more sense for them to stick around and help rear siblings than to go try and found a nest on their own and maybe fail and expend a lot of energy and have all of those risks. In addition, it helps them learn the skills that they need to be successful in the future. Now, we've been talking about parental care, but we also touched briefly on parasitism with those cuckoos. Now, parasitism is interesting because we see a variety of categories here. We have specialist parasites and occasional parasites. So these are all species that parasitize other broods, like those cuckoos that we saw where they lay their eggs in other nests. Now, some of them only parasitize in some circumstances. Some of them parasitize all the time. And some of them are extreme specialists where they parasitize only very particular species. So here we can see, we've got multiple origins of the specialist parasites where they're always being parasitic on other nests. Now this is talking about interspecific, where they're laying eggs in other species' nests. We can also see intraspecific parasitism, where one bird might lay eggs in a nest of a different bird of the same species. We can also see this in fish. So this intraspecific nest parasite is where we've got this parasitism, but it's within the species, and from there, so that's what we often see here in general, and then it expands out to other species, and from there out to other to being specialized and having this be the only thing that you do. All right, so that's parental care. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. There is an activity online. As I said, you can do that either individually or in groups, but if you do it in groups, please let me, please make sure that you record who did the work, so that I make sure that I can give you credit for that. All right. And I will see you next week. All right. Be well.